They called her crazy for saving the crippled stallion. Hours later, someone started screaming. The barn door slammed open before dawn, and a man's voice tore through the frozen dark of Coldwater Ridge, a sound no one in that valley had ever heard him make before, and no one would forget hearing after. Hours earlier, that same man had smiled at a woman he believed was too broken to fight back. He had been wrong about that for longer than he realized. By the time the sun cleared the eastern hills, the scream coming out of that barn would rearrange everything the town of Marrow Creek thought it understood about weakness, about mercy, and about a crippled horse nobody else had wanted. Before we go any further, ask yourself something. If every single person in your town told you a decision was foolish, would you still make it? If something quieter than opinion told you it was right? Eleanor Vance did exactly that, and what it cost her, and what it gave back to her, is the reason this story exists. Drop the name of your town or city in the comments before you keep watching tonight. Hit that like button, and subscribe if stories about quiet endurance and unexpected justice mean something to you. Because what happens inside that barn before sunrise will stay with you. Now let's go back to where it started, on a cold December morning that looked, at first, like nothing at all. The ranch sat at the end of a gravel road that almost nobody used anymore, 5 miles outside a town called Marrow Creek, where the hills rolled brown and stiff under a sky the color of dishwater left too long in the basin. Eleanor Vance had lived on that land for 31 years, first as a young wife trailing behind her husband with feed buckets banging against her knees, and now, at 58, as a widow trailing behind something far heavier than buckets. Dr. Thomas Vance had been the only large animal veterinarian most ranchers across 3 counties had ever fully trusted, a man whose truck was as familiar on those back roads as the mail carriers, a man who pulled calves at midnight and stitched torn flanks by flashlight without complaint. When the cancer found him, it did not find him quickly. It found him slow, patient, methodical, unwinding across 14 months of hospital corridors, whispered prognosis, and medical bills that arrived like a second disease layered directly over the first. Eleanor sold the northern 40 acres to cover the last, most desperate round of treatment. She never told a soul that. She let the town assume it was simply hard times, the kind that occasionally swallowed even careful ranch families, and she carried the actual truth alone, the way she had once carried the bedpans and the medication charts and the sound of his final breath in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic layered over the fading scent of hay dust still clinging to his boots by the door. When he died, the house went quiet in a way that did not resemble peace. It resembled a breath held too long, waiting for permission it would never receive. The neighbors were kind for exactly as long as custom demanded, and then their kindness cooled into a different currency entirely, something closer to pity mixed uneasily with suspicion. Eleanor had never once balanced the ranch's books without Thomas seated beside her at the kitchen table, his reading glasses low on his nose. She had never negotiated a hay contract, never argued down a vet bill, never told a cattle buyer his offer insulted 30 years of careful breeding. Within a year of the funeral, the story circulating through Marrow Creek had hardened into something simple and unkind. The widow Vance was slipping. The widow Vance could not manage that ranch alone. Somebody ought to step in before she does something that cannot be undone. There had been a moment, early in that first year of widowhood, when the town's judgment might have gone another way. A handful of neighbors had shown up unasked that first spring to help her with calving season. And for a few weeks Eleanor had let herself believe the community might simply absorb her loss the way it absorbed most things out here, without ceremony, without permanent alteration to how she was seen. But help like that rarely sustains itself past the season it was offered for, and by summer the visits had thinned to nothing, replaced by the kind of distant, watchful concern that costs nothing and changes nothing, the kind that talks about a person rather than to them. Somebody had already appointed himself. Harlan Vance, Thomas's younger brother by 13 years, had built a modest insurance brokerage into the financial backbone of half the ranches in the valley, writing policies on livestock, equipment, land, and increasingly, on the quiet trust of people who had no obvious reason to withhold it from him. He wore an easy, unhurried smile, and a voice that never rose no matter what he wanted, which made it all the more unsettling on the rare occasions he didn't get it. He visited Eleanor twice a month, always with some small errand disguised as concern, checking a fence line here, offering to review a policy there, and always leaving behind the quiet suggestion that she stood one bad decision away from losing everything Thomas had spent a lifetime building. She had learned, over that first hollow year, to recognize his visits by the particular sound of his truck tires on gravel, a sound that lifted her shoulders toward her ears before he'd even climbed out of the cab. Winter that year came early and stayed mean. The pond froze solid by the second week of November. Eleanor kept exactly 11 head of cattle now, down from the 200 the ranch once carried. And most days her only real conversation happened with the animals themselves. Low words offered while she broke ice off the trough or forked hay into a manger that used to require far more of it. She had grown, without quite noticing the shift, into a woman who spoke mostly to creatures that could not repeat what she said. And there was a particular kind of safety in that, and a particular kind of loneliness too. Thomas had been the one who read the land, who could look at a cloud bank stacking over the western ridge and tell her, correctly, how many hours remained before the temperature dropped. Eleanor had absorbed fragments of that knowledge across 3 decades without ever fully trusting her own version of it, and now, alone, she found herself second-guessing whether the way she second-guessed almost everything else that used to live in the space between them. She kept his barn coat hanging by the back door, not entirely out of sentiment, though there was some of that too, but because the pockets still held things he had left there, a folding knife, a stub of pencil, a scrap of paper with a farrier's phone number neither of them had used in years. She had not moved a single item. Moving them felt, obscurely, like agreeing that he wasn't coming back through that door, and some mornings she was not yet willing to agree to that. The house itself had begun keeping its own quiet ledger. A gutter sagged on the north side, and nobody came to fix it. A window in the spare bedroom had cracked during a hard frost the previous January and stayed cracked, taped over with clear packing tape gone yellow at the edges. None of it amounted to an emergency on its own. All of it together formed a slow, accumulating evidence of a life running on less than it needed, and everyone who drove past on the county road could read that evidence as easily as Eleanor could, whether or not they ever said so out loud at the feed store counter. That Saturday began the way most of her Saturdays began that winter, with frost thick enough on the inside of the kitchen window that she had to breathe on the glass before she could see the thermometer nailed to the porch post outside. She fed the 11 cattle first, breaking a skin of ice off the trough with the heel of her boot, then sat for a few minutes at the kitchen table with black coffee and a slice of bread she didn't finish, listening to the radio weather report repeat itself twice before she finally reached over and switched it off. Pauline's call about the trailer came a little after 7, brisk and practical, and Eleanor had nearly said no, had nearly told her the roads looked too rough for the drive into town, before some restlessness she didn't examine too closely made her say yes instead. The livestock auction happened the first Saturday of December, inside a corrugated steel barn on the edge of Marrow Creek that smelled permanently of diesel exhaust, wet manure, and burnt coffee from a machine nobody ever cleaned. Eleanor rarely attended anymore. Thomas used to bring her along to evaluate breeding stock, back when the ranch still ran real numbers and the future still resembled something worth planning around. She came that Saturday only because her neighbor Pauline had asked for help loading a trailer afterward, and Eleanor had nothing pulling harder at her calendar, which was, in its own quiet way, its own small grief. The auctioneer's rhythm rattled through the tin rafters as pin after pin of cattle rotated through the ring below a bank of buzzing sodium lights. Eleanor stood near the back with her coat collar turned up against a draft that found every seam in the building, watching without really watching, the way a person watches rain. Then the gate at the far end groaned open on a hinge that needed oil, and the crowd's noise dipped into something uglier and more attentive all at once. A stallion limped into the ring. A chestnut animal that had clearly, once, been magnificent, deep through the chest, long through the leg, carrying the kind of bone structure that spoke of bloodlines nobody in that room could afford to breed. Now his ribs showed in faint ridges beneath a dull, patchy coat, and his back left leg dragged with every step, the hoof turned at an angle that made even hardened ranchers wince and glance away toward the exit signs. Someone near Eleanor muttered that it would be a mercy to just put the thing down rather than parade it in front of paying customers. A man in the front row laughed, short and low, and said something about the glue factory that made the woman beside him swat his arm without much real conviction behind it. Eleanor did not laugh. Something in her went very still, the particular stillness of recognition arriving before understanding does. The stallion's head hung low, ears half-pinned, but every few seconds his eyes swept the crowd with an alertness that did not match the surrender in the rest of his body, as if some stubborn part of him refused to fully hand himself over to the pain. It was a look she had seen before, in a hospital bed, in a man who kept trying to sit up on his own long after his body had stopped agreeing to cooperate. Her hand went up before the auctioneer had even finished announcing an opening number nobody wanted to touch. A ripple moved through the crowd, heads turning toward her, because everyone in that barn knew exactly who she was, and believed they knew exactly what kind of decisions she'd been making lately. Harlan stood 3 rows over, arms crossed, a paper coffee cup forgotten in one hand, watching her with an expression that did not shift even as the bidding, such as it was, ended almost before it began. Nobody wanted to compete against a widow for a crippled stallion that most of them assumed would be dead within the month regardless of what she did with him. The gavel came down hard. Valoroso, according to a faded paper tag still clipped to his halter, belonged to her now, for less than the price of a used truck tire. 2 ranch hands worked Valoroso through the chute with a wariness that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with a 600-kilogram animal who no longer trusted proximity to anyone. He balked twice at the trailer ramp, weight rocking backward onto the good leg, and each time Eleanor found herself stepping closer without quite deciding to, murmuring something low enough that only the horse could have heard it over the noise of the yard. By the time the trailer gate finally latched, a small knot of onlookers had gathered near the fence rail, arms folded, watching the transaction with the particular fascination people reserve for a spectacle they expect to end badly. Pauline caught her sleeve outside in the gravel lot, her breath fogging in the cold, voice pitched low with what sounded like real concern layered under real frustration. She asked Eleanor what on earth she thought she was doing, spending money she plainly did not have to spare on an animal that would likely die within weeks no matter what anyone did for him. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She was watching 2 ranch hands wrestle Valoroso toward the loading chute, watching the way his whole body flinched from a hand that came near his hindquarters too fast, watching the particular tension of a body that has learned, thoroughly, that pain arrives through human hands. When she finally spoke, her voice came out quiet enough that Pauline had to lean in to catch it at all. She said she wasn't asking anyone to understand it. She said it the way a person states a fact about weather, not an argument, and Pauline's mouth opened and then closed again, unsure what there was left to say to that. Harlan approached as she finished the paperwork at a folding table near the office, his boots unhurried on the cold concrete, coffee cup finally set down somewhere behind him. He didn't ask why she'd done it. He simply observed, almost gently, that Thomas would have had plenty to say about a horse in that condition, and that it was a shame he wasn't around anymore to say it. The words found exactly the soft place they were aimed at, and Eleanor's pen hovered over the last line of the transfer form for one long second before she finished her signature and walked past him without offering a reply. Behind her, she heard him exhale something that might have been a laugh or might have been disappointment, and either way it followed her out into the cold. The trailer ride home took 40 minutes along roads half glazed with old ice, and Eleanor spent nearly every one of them glancing at the small rearview mirror mounted to catch the horse compartment. Watching Valoroso's dark eye reflected back at her, wide, wet, and unreadable in the gray light. By the time she backed the trailer up to the old barn, dusk had already bruised the hills a deep purple, and the temperature had dropped enough that her breath hung in front of her face, like something solid, while she worked the ramp latch loose with stiff fingers. Getting him off the trailer took the better part of an hour. He did not want to move, and when he finally did, each step became a negotiation between exhaustion and something else, something that made him keep trying anyway, his bad legs swinging wide and planting with a stiffness that made the whole barn go silent except for the ragged sound of his breathing. Eleanor did not rush him. She stood at a careful distance, the lead rope slack in her gloved hand, letting the animal find his own broken rhythm toward the stall. She had spent the entire afternoon bedding down with fresh straw, the first fresh straw that barn had held in over a year. She spent the hours between unloading him and midnight simply sitting on an upturned crate a few feet outside the stall door, not attempting to touch him, letting the barn's warmth and the low sound of her own breathing become familiar background noise rather than threat. Twice he startled at nothing at all, ears snapping toward some sound only he could register. And both times she stayed exactly where she was, offering nothing but stillness, until his weight settled again and his head dropped an inch lower toward the straw. It was the kind of patience Thomas used to practice with fractious animals, an almost boring, unglamorous discipline that had never made for interesting conversation, but had saved more lives on that ranch than any single surgical skill he possessed. It was close to midnight when she finally went looking for Thomas's old veterinary cabinet, rolled into the corner of the tack room, and untouched since the week of the funeral. The hinges complained loudly when she forced them open. Inside, everything sat exactly as he had left it, arranged with the obsessive precision of a man who trusted his instruments more than he trusted luck or timing. Hoof testers hung on their hooks. A portable radiographic unit, outdated by clinic standards but still functional, waited in its padded case, the same unit Thomas had used for field diagnostics whenever a horse could not be safely trailered anywhere else. A leather roll of surgical picks lay folded beside it, still faintly smelling of the disinfectant he used to keep them. She remembered, standing in the cold tack room with the cabinet doors still open, a night nearly 20 years earlier when Thomas had let her run the same unit alone on a colicking gelding while he scrubbed in for emergency surgery 2 counties over, talking her through the settings by phone with a patience she had not appreciated nearly enough at the time. He had told her once, half joking, that she had better hands for this work than she gave herself credit for, and she had laughed it off the way she laughed off most compliments meant to steady her rather than flatter her. Standing there now, decades later, the joke did not feel like a joke anymore. It felt like the only inheritance he had left her that might actually matter tonight. She wheeled the radiographic unit out to the barn on an old hand truck, moving carefully across frozen ground, and set it up outside Valoroso's stall with hands that seemed to remember the motions better than her mind did. Muscle memory built across years spent holding lights and passing instruments while Thomas worked beside her. The stallion watched every movement with an unblinking stillness, ears swiveling toward each metallic clank, but he did not pull away when she finally approached his hind leg with the sensor plate, murmuring nothing specific, just a low, even stream of sound meant only to say that nothing here tonight was going to hurt him. The image that came up on the small monitor screen made her go completely still, buried in the tissue surrounding the old fracture site, where a natural healing process should have shown the rough, disorganized knit of bone repairing itself over time. There was a shape far too clean, far too deliberate, to belong to any accident. A surgical pin, the kind used only in controlled orthopedic procedures, sat positioned in a way that would guarantee the leg could never set correctly no matter how many months or years passed. This had not happened by chance. This injury had been made permanent, on purpose, by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why. Eleanor sat back hard on the overturned bucket she'd been using as a stool, staring at the small screen until the single bulb overhead buzzed and the wind found a gap in the old siding to whistle through. She thought about insurance forms filled out in careful, confident handwriting. She thought about policies written against valuable animals and payouts triggered neatly by documented, permanent unsoundness. She thought about a name that had been circling the edges of her life for a full year now, a man who always arrived offering help that somehow always required her signature first. She printed the image twice from the small built-in printer, folded one copy into the inside pocket of her coat, and hid the second beneath the false bottom of Thomas's old instrument case, a compartment he had built himself years earlier for reasons he never fully explained, a compartment only she and he had ever known existed. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere down the valley a dog barked twice and then went quiet, and Eleanor sat a long time in the dark barn beside a horse who had, without either of them quite realizing it yet, become a witness. She ran through the timeline in her head, slow and deliberate, the way Thomas used to walk through a diagnosis out loud, even when no one else was in the room to hear it. Valoroso had been a competition jumper once, according to the auction paperwork, owned by a breeding operation 2 counties north that Eleanor vaguely recalled Harlan mentioning at some family gathering years earlier, back when his business was smaller and his smile hadn't yet calcified into something permanent. A catastrophic injury. A quiet sale at a loss. A policy, presumably, written somewhere in between those two events by someone who understood exactly how much a permanently unsound animal could be worth on paper, provided the right person filed the right claim at the right time. None of it proved anything yet. All of it pointed in the same uncomfortable direction. She did not sleep that night, not really. She sat with her coat still on in the kitchen, the printed image resting on the table in front of her beside a mug of coffee that went cold untouched, and somewhere past 2 in the morning, she caught herself talking out loud to an empty chair, the way she sometimes still did, asking Thomas what he would have done with proof like this in his hands. The chair, predictably, offered nothing back, but the question itself steadied her, the way it always had, even now. Harlan's truck came up the gravel road at 8 the next morning, earlier than his usual visits by a full 2 hours, which told Eleanor something before he had said a single word. She met him on the porch instead of letting him inside, arms crossed hard against the cold, watching him climb the steps with the easy, practiced warmth of a man who had never once considered that his welcome might eventually run out. He told her he'd already heard about the auction, word traveling the way it always traveled in a town that small. He told her it was, in his words, a generous thing she'd attempted, but that anyone with eyes could see the animal was suffering, and that prolonging suffering for the sake of a gesture wasn't kindness dressed up as anything. It was simple cruelty wearing a better costume. He offered, out of what he called respect for Thomas's memory, to personally cover the cost of a humane euthanasia, and he produced from his jacket a folded document, a custody transfer form that would place the stallion under his authority for what he termed proper and dignified disposal. Eleanor did not reach for the papers. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd already spoken to a man he knew at the state licensing board, that keeping an unsound animal in visible distress on her property could, in certain circumstances, invite an animal welfare complaint she would have no easy way of defending herself against, alone, without legal counsel, without the standing Thomas's name used to lend her automatically in rooms like that. He said it the way a man says something he wishes weren't true, gentle regret dressed carefully over what was, underneath, a threat plainly stated. He pressed gently, the way water presses against a dam rather than a wall, patient and thoroughly certain of eventual success. He reminded her, in a voice that never once rose, how the whole town already worried about her out here alone on that failing property. How a decision like keeping a suffering animal alive purely for sentiment would only feed that worry further. How it would be so much simpler, so much kinder to absolutely everyone, including the horse itself, if she simply signed where indicated. His pen was already uncapped, resting between 2 fingers, waiting. She asked him, without lifting her voice above his, why an insurance broker would be so personally eager to handle the disposal of an animal that carried no policy, belonged to no client of his, and had never once been mentioned to her by name before yesterday's auction. Something in his face held very still for exactly 1 second too long. He recovered smoothly enough, mentioned something vague about community responsibility, about having known the stallion's previous owner and wanting to help settle an unfortunate situation with some measure of dignity attached to it. Eleanor told him the horse wasn't going anywhere at all, and that she would appreciate the same respect for her decisions that he clearly expected for his own. The warmth drained out of his expression by careful degrees, replaced by something colder and far more familiar to anyone who had ever watched him negotiate down a claim he had no intention of paying. He left without the transfer papers, but not without one last comment, delivered lightly, almost as an afterthought tossed over his shoulder on the way back to his truck, about how the co-op board was meeting Thursday to discuss delinquent accounts on properties bordering the new logistics corridor the town was so eager to court, and how he'd genuinely hate to see her name mentioned in that particular conversation. She watched his taillights disappear down the gravel road, then stood a long moment on the porch with her arms still crossed, the cold working its way through her coat sleeves. Behind her, through the kitchen window, she could see the answering machine's small red light blinking, 3 messages already waiting, none of which she had the stomach to hear yet. She went to the barn instead, where the only demands were simple ones: water, hay, a low word of reassurance, and where nobody wanted her signature on anything at all. The power went out 2 days later, in the middle of the coldest stretch of the season so far. Eleanor drove to Pauline's house to use the landline and learned there was an outstanding balance dating back to the last brutal months of Thomas's illness, a balance that had somehow, quietly, never been fully resolved on paper, and had now become suddenly, urgently due in full. She stood in her own kitchen that evening with a kerosene lamp casting long shadows across the counter she used to share with a man who filled the room without trying. And out in the barn, Valoroso shifted his weight in the dark, favoring the leg that Eleanor now understood carried far more than an ordinary old injury. It carried evidence, and evidence, she was beginning to understand in her bones, made her genuinely dangerous to certain people and genuinely isolated from almost everyone else. Later that week, at the feed store in town, the clerk who had known her for 2 decades kept the conversation short and his eyes on the register rather than on her face, and outside on the sidewalk 2 ranchers stopped talking the moment she passed, resuming only once the bell over the door had fully stopped ringing behind her. She bought what she needed and left without lingering, the truck's heater rattling the whole drive home, and she did not cry, though something in her chest sat heavy enough that it might as well have been the same thing. That evening she drove past the co-op building on her way home and saw Harlan's truck already parked out front, an hour before the board was scheduled to meet. His silhouette visible through the lit window, standing close beside 2 men she recognized as county commissioners, all 3 of them laughing at something none of them seemed in any hurry to share. She did not slow down. She did not need to hear the conversation to understand its shape. Men like Harlan did not need to say her name directly for a room to end up leaning against her anyway, and she had learned, across the last difficult year, that some rooms simply were not built to hold a woman alone, however capable she turned out to be. At home, she checked on Valoroso by the failing light of a single flashlight, its batteries weakening enough that the beam had gone the color of weak tea. He nickered low when she entered, an animal sound she had not heard from him yet, something almost conversational, and she stood at the stall door a long moment, simply listening to him breathe, grateful, in a way she could not have explained to Pauline or anyone else in town, for the particular honesty of an animal that had no political reason to pretend around her. The storm rolled in on the 3rd night after the power failed, the kind of Oregon storm that arrived sideways, rain slashing against the barn's tin roof in a rhythm that made conversation with the animals nearly impossible without raising your voice above it. Eleanor worked by lamplight, 3 kerosene lamps arranged in a careful triangle around Valoroso's stall, their flames guttering hard every time the wind found its way through gaps in the old boards. She had made her decision 2 days earlier, sitting alone at the kitchen table with Thomas's surgical notes spread open in front of her, his handwriting cramped and precise across the margins of a veterinary manual he had annotated over 2 full decades of practice. The pen needed to come out. No county veterinarian would touch a procedure carrying this much legal weight without a mountain of paperwork and permissions she simply did not have time to secure, and the state fraud investigators, once she finally found the courage to call them, would need real time to arrive, time that Valoroso's leg, and possibly Valoroso's life, might not actually have if Harlan decided to move first. All afternoon before the storm broke, she had moved through the barn preparing with a kind of methodical calm that surprised even her. Boiling water on the small propane burner Thomas once kept for exactly this purpose, laying out gauze and suture material in the order his notes described, checking and rechecking the sedative dosage against the stallion's estimated weight until the numbers no longer swam in front of her tired eyes. She had called Pauline once that afternoon, not to explain what she intended to do, but simply to hear another human voice, and had hung up after 4 minutes of ordinary conversation about nothing in particular, steadier for it in a way she couldn't have articulated if asked. So she would do it herself. She had assisted Thomas on dozens of field procedures across their marriage, had held instruments steady while his hands worked with total confidence, had absorbed by simple proximity what most people only ever learn through formal training. It was not the same thing as truly knowing how, not fully, and she understood that difference clearly even as she pulled on a pair of surgical gloves that no longer quite fit her hands the way they had fit his. But something was more than what the horse currently had, and something would have to be enough tonight. She sedated him with slow, deliberate care, using dosages copied precisely from Thomas's own handwritten notes, then waited through the long, silent minutes for the drug to take proper hold, watching his eyelids grow heavy, watching his great weight shift and finally settle against the stall wall with a sound like something enormous exhaling. Thunder cracked somewhere close enough to rattle the barn's small windows in their frames, and Eleanor made the first incision along the old scar tissue with hands steadier than she had any real right to expect, though her breath came fast and shallow beneath the surgical mask she'd found folded in the same rolling cabinet where everything else still waited for her. The procedure did not go smoothly. 20 minutes in, one of the kerosene lamps guttered out entirely under a gust that found its way through the loft door she'd forgotten to latch, and Eleanor worked for nearly a full minute in near darkness before she managed to relight it with hands slick with disinfectant, her heart slamming hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Valoroso's leg twitched despite the sedation, a reflex rather than a conscious movement, but enough to make her pause with her fingers still inside the wound, waiting, counting her own pulse until the tremor passed and the barn settled again into something closer to stillness. It took nearly 2 hours to locate the pin fully, buried deeper than the imaging had suggested, wrapped in scar tissue that had grown around it the way the leg itself had tried, and failed, to heal properly around the sabotage buried at its center. When she finally worked it free with a slow, careful twist, the metal caught the lamplight for one brief moment. Small and unremarkable, a piece of surgical hardware no larger than a nail, and yet somehow capable of destroying a $50,000 animal's entire future, and by extension, of quietly funding whatever scheme required his ruin to look like nothing more than bad luck. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour, a fresh gust tore a loose sheet of tin free from the roof above the loft with a shriek of metal that made Valoroso's whole body flinch under the sedation, and Eleanor froze with the pin half free, waiting through 3 long seconds to see whether he would fully surface before the drug had a chance to finish its work. He did not. His breathing settled again, ragged but steady, and she exhaled slowly through the surgical mask and kept working, aware now of just how alone she truly was out here, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, with no power, no phone line to the barn, and an animal under her hands whose life had come to depend entirely on the steadiness of her own 2 fingers. She cleaned and packed the wound exactly the way Thomas's notes instructed, her hands moving almost on their own now, exhaustion and adrenaline blurring together into something that felt strangely close to peace. Outside, the storm finally began loosening its grip, rain softening from a roar into a low murmur against the roof. Valoroso's breathing deepened as the sedation thinned, and somewhere in the space between unconsciousness and waking, he shifted his great head and let it rest against Eleanor's chest, his breath moving warm against her collarbone in one long, shuddering exhale that seemed to empty something out of both of them at exactly the same moment. She stayed like that a long time, unmoving, one bare hand resting against his jaw, listening to the storm finish its business over the hills, and for the first time since Thomas's funeral, the barn did not feel like a place holding its breath. For a few quiet minutes, it felt like a place where something had finally let go. By the gray hour before true dawn, she had already made the call she'd been putting off for 3 days, first to the county sheriff's office and then, at their suggestion, to the state agricultural fraud division, whose night operator promised an investigator could reach Marrow Creek by mid-morning at the latest. She did not yet know that mid-morning would arrive too late to matter for someone else's plans that were already, at that very hour, being loaded into the back of a truck 5 miles down the road. The first sound was a truck door, closer to the barn than the house, its engine cut too quietly to be a coincidence. Eleanor was still awake, sitting on the same overturned bucket with a wool blanket around her shoulders, when she heard boots crossing gravel with the deliberate care of someone who did not want to be heard at all. She rose slowly, every muscle in her back aching from the night's work, and moved to the small window at the front of the barn just as a flashlight beam swept low across the yard. Harlan came through the side door rather than the main one, flashlight in one hand and, in the other, a small hard-sided case that Eleanor recognized instantly from years of watching Thomas carry its near-identical twin, a field veterinary kit built for administering controlled substances to large animals quickly and without complication. His face in the flashlight's upward glow looked nothing like the smooth, patient man who had sat on her porch days earlier with an uncapped pen. It looked like a man who had run entirely out of other options and knew it. He told her, without any preamble at all, that the investigator's arrival didn't have to mean what she thought it meant, that horses die of complications constantly, that a compassionate euthanasia performed quietly before any official inspection would simply read, on paper, as an act of mercy toward a suffering animal, and that no imaging, no hidden pin, no evidence of any kind would matter in the slightest if the horse were already gone by the time anyone official actually arrived to examine him. Eleanor rose fully from the bucket and placed herself directly between him and the stall door, telling him plainly that it was already too late for that particular plan, that the call had already gone out hours ago, that people were already on the road toward them right now. Something flickered across his face at that, quick and involuntary, the first honest thing he had shown her in over a year, and then it was gone again, buried back under the same practiced calm he had worn onto her porch days earlier. He did not stop moving forward. He told her, almost gently, that she was making this harder than it needed to be, that whatever she thought she had documented would mean very little once the animal itself was no longer available for anyone to examine. That paper without a body behind it rarely held up the way people assumed it would in a county this small, with a judge who had known his family for 30 years. Eleanor did not answer him. She had run out of things to say to a man who had already decided, long before tonight, exactly how far he was willing to go. He unlatched the case with hands that trembled slightly, despite his voice staying almost level, drawing up a syringe with the fluid, practiced motion of a man who had clearly rehearsed this exact sequence in his mind more than once during the drive over. What neither of them had properly accounted for was Valoroso. The stallion, no longer buckling beneath the weight of an untreated fracture, no longer folding inward against constant unmanaged pain, rose from where he had been resting with a suddenness that startled them both, his freshly bandaged leg bearing weight in a way it had not managed in longer than anyone in that barn truly knew. He did not rear. He did not panic in the disorganized way a wounded animal might have panicked only days before. He simply stepped forward, deliberate and enormous, placing his full weight between Eleanor and the man holding the syringe, ears pinned flat against his skull, nostrils flared wide enough to show red, a low sound building deep in his chest that had nothing gentle left inside it at all. For a moment nobody in the barn moved at all, the three of them locked in a strange, breathing stillness broken only by the horse's ragged exhale and the last of the storm dripping steadily off the eaves outside. Eleanor did not step back. She stood exactly where she had been standing, one hand still resting lightly against Valoroso's shoulder, less to control him now than simply to remain near him, and something in that closeness seemed to steady the animal further, his weight settling forward another inch, closing the last of the distance between himself and the man against the wall. Harlan froze completely. 600 kilograms of animal that had every reason in the world to distrust human hands now stood close enough that its breath stirred the collar of his jacket, and for the first time since walking through that door, his composure cracked entirely down the middle. He stumbled backward into the old iron feed rack bolted to the far wall, metal groaning under the impact, and the horse advanced another half step, close enough now that retreat in any direction meant direct contact. The barn's main door swung open at that exact moment, flooding the space with headlight glare and the particular pulsing blue-white of a patrol light rolling silently across the walls and rafters. Two deputies who had responded early to Eleanor's overnight call stood filling the doorway, and just behind them, a third figure carrying a state agency badge on a lanyard, having made considerably better time overnight than anyone had promised her. Harlan's hand, still gripping the loaded syringe, shook hard enough that the instrument finally slipped free of his fingers entirely, shattering against the concrete floor in a sound sharp and small and enormous all at once inside the sudden, ringing silence that followed. Cornered now by an animal he had personally tried twice to destroy, illuminated by the very authorities he had spent 3 days trying desperately to outrun, whatever remained of his composure finally gave way completely, all at once, like a dam that had held for exactly as long as it could, and not 1 second longer. The scream that tore out of him was not even words at first, just raw, unfiltered sound, the sound of a man watching every carefully constructed lie collapse in real time while pinned in place by 600 kilograms of living, breathing consequence. Then the words did come, tumbling out fast and disorganized in a confession nobody in that barn had actually asked him for yet, about the policy he'd written on a horse that was never truly his to ensure, about the pin, about a payout he had been counting on for well over a year to cover debts nobody in Marrow Creek had ever suspected him of carrying, about how it was only ever supposed to be a horse, an animal, a single line item on a claim form, never meant to matter this much to anyone at all, least of all to him. The deputies moved Valoroso back with quiet, practiced patience once Eleanor stepped forward and laid a bare hand against his shoulder, murmuring low and steady until the tension finally left his frame in one long, visible shudder that seemed to travel the entire length of his body. Harlan was handcuffed against the same feed rack he had stumbled into moments earlier, his composure gone completely now, replaced by the flat, hollowed-out look of a man already calculating exactly how much he had lost in the span of 90 seconds. Eleanor gave her statement standing in the barn doorway as the sky finally lightened fully to gray, her voice steady in a way that surprised the younger of the two deputies enough that he glanced twice at his own notepad rather than at her face while he wrote. She answered every question plainly, without embellishment, describing the imaging, the pin, the procedure she performed without a license to perform it, and did not flinch when the investigator asked whether she understood that detail could complicate matters for her too. She said she understood it fine, and that she would do the same thing again regardless, and something in her flat certainty seemed to settle the question for him more thoroughly than a more careful answer might have. The state investigator photographed the shattered syringe still glinting on the concrete, the imaging printouts Eleanor produced from the false bottom of the instrument case, and the wound itself, carefully documented before the local veterinarian arrived at sunrise to properly redress it under legitimate supervision. Within the week, the full scope of the fraud unfolded publicly, splashed across the front page of the regional paper that Marrow Creek residents still actually read over coffee, revealing not only the insurance scheme built specifically around Valoroso's engineered injury, but two disturbingly similar claims Harlan had filed against livestock over the preceding 4 years, patterns nobody had ever thought to question closely, because nobody had wanted to question the man who personally wrote half their policies and knew most of their financial business besides. The co-op board that had once quietly discussed Eleanor's delinquent accounts now found itself discussing an entirely different category of liability. Pauline appeared on Eleanor's porch 3 days later, not with concern this time, but with a casserole dish balanced against one hip and an apology that came out clumsy and half-formed, the way real apologies usually do when they matter. Not everyone in town made that same turn so easily. Some neighbors stayed quiet and uncertain, unsure how to hold both versions of Eleanor Vance inside their heads at once. The fragile widow they had spent a year imagining, and the woman who had personally operated on a full-grown stallion by lamplight during a storm rather than surrender him to a man with a syringe. The trial itself never happened in the way the town expected. Harlan's attorney negotiated a plea within 6 weeks, sparing Marrow Creek the spectacle of a courtroom where half the witness list would have been neighbors testifying against a man who had handled their mortgages and their livestock claims alike for the better part of a decade. Restitution orders followed, slow and partial the way restitution orders often are, and Eleanor never saw a dollar of it, nor had she expected to. What she wanted from the outcome had very little to do with money, and everything to do with a horse who no longer had to fear the sound of a truck door in the dark. The power was restored once the utility company's clerical error was, quietly and without apology, acknowledged and reversed. The land she had sold years earlier during Thomas's illness stayed sold regardless. Some costs, once paid in full, simply do not reverse no matter how the surrounding story eventually changes shape. Eleanor never got those 40 acres back, and she carried the arithmetic of that loss the way she carried most things now, without display, folded quietly into the ordinary rhythm of morning chores and evening feed, a private ledger that balanced in her own way and answered to no one else. The two commissioners Harlan had been standing beside outside the co-op window that evening quietly withdrew their support for the logistics corridor once his name appeared in the fraud unit's public filing, and the project that had once threatened to swallow half the properties bordering town stalled indefinitely, then died the following spring without any formal announcement at all. Nobody in Marrow Creek ever thanked Eleanor for that outcome directly, and she never once brought it up herself, though she noticed, quietly, that the men who used to stop talking when she passed on the sidewalk had mostly started nodding to her instead. Spring arrived slower to Coldwater Ridge than it did to the lower valley floor, but it arrived. By April, Valoroso's gait had steadied into something that would never quite be perfect, a faint hitch remaining in the leg that had been broken twice, once through deliberate cruelty and once, necessarily, through rescue. It no longer seemed to matter to either of them. He followed Eleanor across the yard with the loose, unhurried devotion of an animal that had decided, somewhere inside a storm-lit barn months earlier, exactly whose side he belonged on, and had shown no sign of reconsidering since. Eleanor rebuilt the ranch slowly across that spring and into the summer that followed, not back into what it had once been under Thomas, but into something new that belonged entirely to her. A smaller operation focused now on rehabilitating horses other people had already given up on, animals carrying old injuries and older reputations. The exact kind of animal nobody but her ever bid on at those cold Saturday auctions. The instrument cabinet stayed in the tack room where it had always lived, its false bottom empty now, its careful contents returned fully to ordinary daily use. Word of what happened in that barn traveled slowly outward through the valley over the following months, and a few of the harder cases that arrived at her gate that year came specifically because someone, somewhere, had heard the story and thought of her first. She never advertised for the work. She never needed to. By autumn, a second animal arrived, a sway-backed mare nobody local wanted, delivered by a rancher 2 towns over who had heard, secondhand and imperfectly, about the widow who fixed what other people threw away. Eleanor took her in without asking many questions, the way she suspected she would keep doing for as long as her body allowed it. Valoroso watched the newcomer settle into the stall beside his own with an air of proprietary calm, as though he understood, in whatever way horses understand such things, exactly what kind of place this had become and exactly what his role in it now was. Pauline visited more often after that first casserole, and the 2 women fell into an easier rhythm than they'd managed in years. Coffee on the porch some evenings, Pauline talking and Eleanor mostly listening, which suited them both. Nobody in Marrow Creek ever again called her the crazy widow of the horses to her face, though Eleanor suspected the phrase still surfaced occasionally in kitchens she wasn't invited into, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had stopped minding whether it did. Some evenings, driving back from town with the truck bed loaded down with feed, she caught herself slowing at the top of the ridge where the whole valley opened out below her, the ranch small and stubborn in the distance, smoke curling thin from the chimney, and she would sit there a moment with the engine idling before continuing down, not out of hesitation anymore, but something closer to the opposite of it. It was, she had come to understand without ever needing to say it to another living soul, simply the shape her life had settled into now, imperfect, diminished in ways that would never fully mend, and entirely, unmistakably hers. She finally cleared out Thomas's barn coat that November, a full year after the auction, folding it carefully into a box along with the folding knife and the pencil stub and the scrap of paper with the farrier's number still legible in his cramped handwriting. She did not do it because the grief had finished, exactly, but because something in her had grown sturdy enough to carry his memory without needing the coat on the hook to hold it in place for her. The hook stayed empty only a few days before she hung her own coat there instead, and the sight of it did not sting the way she'd braced for. It simply looked, finally, like a house someone was still living in. On quiet evenings, she still sat on the same overturned bucket in the barn, and Valoroso still lowered his great head to rest against her shoulder the exact way he had that first difficult night, the 2 of them keeping company in a silence that had long since stopped feeling like grief and had started, gradually and without ceremony, to feel instead like something closer to peace. The town still tells the story a little differently depending on who happens to be asked, but the barn itself remembers it exactly as it happened. In the particular language barns tend to use for these things, hoofprints pressed deep into old straw, a faint scar running along a chestnut leg, a woman who finally stopped listening to what everyone else insisted she could not do. Nobody ever thinks to ask the horse what he remembers of that night. Maybe he doesn't need to give an answer. Maybe the only answer that ever mattered is that he simply never left her side again. If this story found something worth sitting with tonight, tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever protected something the rest of the world had already quietly given up on. And subscribe if you want more stories exactly like this one. There is always another barn out there somewhere, Another storm building on the horizon. Another quiet person nobody saw coming until it was already too late to stop them.